Oh, lots of people know how to read. You want to read, Ryan?
Sure.
Yeah, you do. All right, help me out here, bub. What's that say?
To remain valuable in our economy, therefore, you must master.
Yeah, it's supposed to say therefore. Yeah, who knows how to? I told you I was illiterate.
You must master the art of quickly learning complicated things.
Right. So that's from a book called Deep Work by Cal Newport, which talks about uninterrupted work without distraction, which is the best way to learn complicated things. And just for example, 2 years ago, we did Angular in this class. Angular JS, totally irrelevant now. Angular 2 replaced it, and it's totally different. So we went with React this time and last year. And we used something called Firebase for the back end in this class, and they completely changed their API in the middle of class the first year, which was very unhelpful. This stuff changes a lot, even once you learn something like React. Last year it was React 14. This year it's 16.3. This stuff changes. You got to be able to keep up. So it's worth getting good at doing uninterrupted, undistracted work. And the nice thing about the bootcamp environment is it lets you pretty much focus on just that for a few weeks. So take advantage of that while you can. So let's talk a little bit about what to expect out of the class. First of all, expect it to be a lot of hard work. You will learn a ton in a very short time. It may be uncomfortable, but that's just your brain growing. It's okay, fight through it. You'll learn a ton in a very short time, but strangely, it may not feel like it. A friend of mine went to a 12-week boot camp, and around week 9, he went to his instructor and said, I don't feel like I've learned anything. And his instructor told him, go look at the homework from week 1. And he looked at that and he realized, oh, okay, we've actually learned a lot in 9 weeks. But the funny thing is, the more you know about a topic, the more you realize you don't know. So you'll become more aware of your shortcomings. But you will learn a lot of stuff in a short time, even if it doesn't feel like it. So expectations. Let's talk about tips. Tip number 1. Who can read pictures? Who wants to read this one? Yeah. That's right. You get out what you Putin. So I've taught a lot of boot camps now. I've taught almost 400 students. And there are definitely a lot of people, most people want to work pretty hard at this. But you definitely see those who work a little harder, who don't stop when they've finished all the homework. And they're the ones who do the best, who attract the most attention from employers and stuff like that. So push yourself to do all the homework and maybe even go beyond the homework once you finish that. Make it look nice. Learn some new feature and try to add that in there. This is not graded. We do look at your work. But so the goal here isn't just to learn just enough to pass. It's not like, I mean, maybe that's not your attitude towards school. It was my attitude towards school. I just wanted to get my A and move on. But this is practical stuff. You want to learn as much as you can. So even if you get the homework working and it works well, go further. See how much you can pack into these 3 weeks. It's worth it. The available material is limitless. There's this big thing called the World Wide Web, which we'll talk about later if you're not familiar with it. And there's just an awful lot of material out there. You can always do more. So let's talk about 2 hypothetical students, Bill and Ted. Both students are excellent. But Bill, he would do all his homework. And then he'd say, okay, I did what's expected of me. I'm going to go to bed. Or I'm going to go duck pin bowling or whatever. Ted, meanwhile, finish his homework and say, I could do even more. So he would do even more. And they both got jobs. They both got decent jobs. Bill is a documentary filmmaker. But Ted, he's freaking John Wick. You can be John Wick too. Just work extra hard. So tip number 2. He's John Wick and Neo, guys. Tip number 2. Try to solve the problems yourself. Again, it may feel uncomfortable. There's going to be a lot of stuff you don't know how to do yet. It will cause you pain, but that is just your brain growing. It's worth it. That's a good thing. So when it feels like you just have no idea how to continue with a task, First, remember to break it down into its smallest components. It may sound like too much. Okay, build a thing, add a new item to a list every time you click a button. That's a lot. I don't know how to do that. Well, do you know how to make a button? Make the button. Do you know how to do anything when a button gets clicked? Okay, just make it do something. Just make it respond to a button click. Do you know how to add an item to the list? Okay, do that part. Put them all together. So break it down into its smallest components, and you'll find that sometimes an overwhelming task is actually very manageable. So break it down, and remember that the documentation is your best friend. I'm going to overuse the phrase that something is your best friend, but for right now, documentation is your best friend. We're going to actually look stuff up in documentation in class, kind of to give you some examples, and to assure you that experienced people do that too. And maybe you'll learn how to read the documentation a little better. And your second best friend after the documentation is Google. Yes, I'm a Google developer expert. I can write code, but only if I have access to Google. There's nothing wrong with Googling it. So when you try to solve the problems yourself, don't stay stuck for too long. Here's a good rule of thumb. Break it down, consult the documentation, Google it, and then give it another 15 minutes. At that point, go ahead and ask for help. It doesn't have to be from us. It can be from us, or it can be from one of your classmates. But get help if you've given it that much. Are you sure you've broken it down to the smallest possible steps? Do that. Don't forget about the documentation. Don't forget about Google. And then give it another 15 minutes. And then don't stay stuck after that. What you don't want to do is spend 2 hours on something and discover that you just made a typo 2 hours ago, and that someone who was more familiar with the error messages could have helped you get past that and move on. Similarly, tip 3A, help each other. Ask for help, but also help each other. Besides the fact that it's just a nice thing to do, it also helps you learn better than if you didn't. Because in order to help explain something to someone else, you have to understand it better than you do just to do the work. I find teaching is actually one of the best ways to really, really learn something. In fact, that's how I scared myself into learning React the first time. I promised I would teach it to 150 people. This was about, no, just kidding. But the first time I taught React, I had never actually done a project in React first. I had a couple months to learn it, but that's how I scared myself into doing it, because more than just making some little toy app in it, I had to be able to actually stand in front of people and explain it. So I had to know it pretty darn well. So if you're helping a classmate and you're both looking at the documentation together, you might actually have a better explanation for why this thing works than if you hadn't done that. So please do help each other. Tip number 4, learn from our mistakes, because inevitably we will make them. I had a student who was in a boot camp of mine. It was a 7-day, 12-hour-a-day boot camp. Completely inhumane. Not my idea, that schedule. And I mean, you could take this not as a compliment, but he told me that one of the things he loved about that class was watching me make mistakes, because he was self-taught prior to that. He'd watched a lot of online tutorials and read a lot of tutorials. And when you look at stuff like that, you can kind of get the impression that all the people doing that are just these master programmers who write it correctly the first time and never have to do any troubleshooting, because they just know exactly what to type at all times. And that just ain't the case. If you're watching an online tutorial or something, you're seeing like the 4th or 5th iteration of that thing. They've already worked through all the bugs. So if it just seems like flawless code flows from their fingertips, that's only because they've edited out the parts where they made mistakes. This is live, so we can't do that. But it's really valuable anyway, and sometimes we'll even make mistakes on purpose, because there are certain error messages that are very, very common and you will inevitably get. And if you see somebody else get them and work through it, it helps you understand, okay, this thing means I'm missing a comma. This one means I put an extra comma where it didn't belong, that kind of stuff. So when I screw up, don't tune out and start daydreaming about Channing Tatum and Matthew McConaughey and T-Rexes. Instead, watch how I troubleshoot it. Watch how I work through it. See how I use the debugging tools and so on, because it's really helpful. Yeah. Sometimes error messages are profoundly unhelpful. But you'll notice some patterns with certain messages that always appear when you do things like put an extra comma somewhere. So tip number 5, don't compare yourselves to others. I know you all have at least a little bit of programming experience, but everyone has different levels of experience coming in. Sometimes there are people who already know JavaScript pretty well and just don't know React. Sometimes there are people who even know a JavaScript framework like Angular or something. Sometimes there are people with a little React experience. And sometimes people have no web experience and have only used like C or something. That's okay. Don't get hung up on how someone else is doing. You know things that they don't know as well. So it's not worth comparing yourself to others. And a corollary to that, don't compare yourselves to others in the other direction and gloat about how awesome you are compared to your classmates. Sometimes that just takes the form of being snotty to each other. Sometimes that takes the form of raising your hand not to actually ask a question, but to ask a question to show off how much you already know. You probably know people like this at the universities. I certainly had classmates like this. They would ask questions all the time, not because they actually had a question, but because they wanted to show off. Hey, I couldn't possibly ask this question unless I already knew way more than everybody else in here. So check me out. So I'll just tell you right now, we're all very impressed. Your reputation precedes you. We're already super impressed with you. So you don't need to do it. You don't need to show off. We already know. All right? Deal? Cool. Thanks. Tip number 6, have some fun. It's going to be hard, and it's easy to feel beaten down after a couple of weeks of this, but stick with it. Celebrate your wins along the way. Appreciate the progress you make. And, hey, this isn't a reality show. Make some friends. All right? Deal? And build some cool stuff. Believe in yourself as I believe in you.